In the shadowy corridors of Hampton Court Palace, where whispers once carried secrets that could topple kingdoms, there lived a girl whose beauty would capture a king's heart and seal her doom. Catherine Howard was barely 20 when she became the fifth wife of Henry VIII, a man whose previous marriages had already painted the Tower of London's stones with blood. What she couldn't know, as she danced in the flickering candlelight of Tudor Court, was that she was dancing toward her death. The year was 1540, and England trembled beneath the iron fist of a king grown paranoid and cruel. Henry VIII, now approaching 50, was no longer the golden prince who had once charmed Europe. Years of disappointment, pain from a festering leg wound, and the relentless pursuit of a male heir had transformed him into something monstrous. His fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves had been annulled after just 6 months, leaving the king desperate for both passion and progeny. It was into this dangerous world that Catherine Howard stepped, like a lamb walking unknowingly into a den of wolves. Catherine was born into the powerful Howard family around 1521, though even her exact birth year remained shrouded in the uncertainty that would plague her entire short life. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a younger son of the Duke of Norfolk, which meant Catherine grew up on the periphery of nobility, close enough to power to smell its intoxicating perfume, too far removed to understand its deadly consequences. When her mother died and her father struggled financially, young Catherine was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Here, in the Duchess's sprawling estate, Catherine's fate began to take shape. The Dowager's household was a place where noble daughters were meant to learn the refined arts of courtly life, but it had become something far more dangerous, a breeding ground for secrets and sexual intrigue. With minimal supervision, young girls and men shared living quarters, creating an atmosphere thick with forbidden desires and whispered promises. Catherine, barely into her teens, became entangled in relationships that would later be twisted into evidence of her treachery. First came Henry Mannix, her music teacher, a man who should have been her guide, but instead became her seducer. Their relationship, inappropriate by any measure, was discovered and supposedly ended. But Catherine's heart, young and searching for love in a world that offered little tenderness to women, soon turned to Francis Derham, a gentleman pensioner in the Duchess's household. What transpired between them would later be debated in courts and chronicled by historians, but by all accounts, their relationship was intense and possibly included promises of marriage that, in the eyes of Tudor law, could be considered a pre-contract, a legal impediment to any future marriage. As Catherine blossomed into a beauty with auburn hair and sparkling eyes, her family's ambitions began to crystallize around her. The Howards had already placed one of their daughters, Anne Boleyn, on the throne, though that had ended with Anne's head on the executioner's block. Now, they saw another opportunity in Catherine's youth and charm. In late 1539, she was brought to court to serve in the household of Anne of Cleves, the king's unloved fourth wife. It was a calculated move that would prove devastatingly successful. Henry VIII noticed Catherine immediately. After the disappointment of his political marriage to the plain and foreign Anne of Cleves, Catherine appeared like a vision of English rose beauty. She was everything and was not young, vivacious, flirtatious, and most importantly, she seemed to genuinely enjoy the king's attention. While Anne of Cleves had recoiled from Henry's advances, Catherine smiled, laughed, and played the part of the enchanted maiden perfectly. The king, starved for genuine affection and desperate to feel young again, fell completely under her spell. The courtship was swift and intoxicating. Henry showered Catherine with gifts, jewels that had once adorned the necks of his previous wives, lands that generated enormous wealth, and most dangerously of all, his complete devotion. Courtiers watched in fascination and horror as the notorious king transformed into a lovesick suitor, writing passionate letters and composing music for his young beloved. By July 1540, just days after his marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, Henry married Catherine in a private ceremony that would make her Queen of England. For a brief, shining moment. It seemed as though Catherine might be the wife who could tame the beast. She brought laughter back to court, and Henry appeared happier than he had been in years. He called her his rose without a thorn, and publicly declared his satisfaction with his marriage. Catherine embraced her role with apparent joy, commissioning beautiful gowns, hosting lavish entertainments, and playing the part of the perfect Tudor queen. But beneath the glittering surface, dangerous currents were already stirring. The past, like a persistent shadow, began to creep into Catherine's present. Her family's enemies at court, jealous of the Howard influence and eager to see them fall, began to whisper about the new queen's history. Rumours spread about her relationships with Manox and Derham, each telling growing more salacious with each repetition. More dangerously, Catherine's own actions as queen began to provide ammunition for those who wished her harm. Whether driven by genuine feelings or simply the reckless behaviour of youth, Catherine began a flirtation with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Culpeper was young, handsome, and everything the aging, increasingly corpulent Henry was not. Their meetings, arranged with the help of Catherine's servant Jane Bullen, the widow of Anne Bullen's executed brother, became increasingly frequent and secretive. Letters were passed, gifts exchanged, and private meetings held in gardens and hidden chambers throughout the royal progresses. The irony was devastating. While Henry believed he had finally found a wife who loved him for himself, Catherine was perhaps falling in love with another man. Her letters to Culpeper, written in her own hand, would later be used as evidence of her guilt. In one, she wrote of her heartbreak at their separation and signed herself as yours, as long as life endures. These were not the words of an innocent friendship, and in the context of Tudor England, where the Queen's body belonged to the King and the realm, they were tantamount to treason. The House of Cards began to collapse in the autumn of 1541, during a royal progress to the north. Stories about Catherine's past finally reached the ears of those who could act upon them. John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer with his own agenda, came forward with information about Catherine's relationships before her marriage. His half-sister, Mary Hall, had served in the Dowager Duchess's household and knew intimate details about Catherine's affairs with Manox and Derham. When this information reached Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he faced a terrible dilemma. Cranmer had survived Henry's courts by knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, but this information was too dangerous to suppress. The king's marriage might be invalid if Catherine had been pre-contracted to Derham, but revealing this truth could cost Cranmer his own life. Henry chose to kill the messenger. After agonizing deliberation, Cranmer chose to write a letter detailing Catherine's past and placed it where Henry would find it during his prayers. The king's reaction was swift and terrible. The man who had been singing Catherine's praises just days before now flew into one of his legendary rages. He ordered Catherine's immediate arrest and imprisonment, and soon the full machinery of Tudor justice was grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. Under torture and threats, Manox, Derham, and eventually Culpeper were arrested and interrogated. The evidence mounted like stones in a wall that would crush Catherine beneath its weight. Catherine, meanwhile, was confined to her chambers at Hampton Court, where she waited in growing terror as her world collapsed around her. She was questioned relentlessly about her past relationships and her correspondence with Culpeper. Her youth, which had once been her greatest asset, now became a liability. She was deemed old enough to know the consequences of her actions, but too young to command sympathy from a court that had already decided her fate. The trials that followed were foregone conclusions. Derham and Culpeper were found guilty of treason and sentenced to death, though Culpeper's sentence was commuted from hanging, drawing, and quartering to the more merciful beheading, likely due to his gentle birth. Catherine herself was never given a formal trial. Instead, Parliament passed a bill of attainder declaring her guilty of concealing her past from the king and committing adultery after her marriage. In February 1542, Catherine Howard was told she would die. She was just 21 years old, though she may have been even younger. Legend says that when she learned of her fate, she asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her cell so that she might practice laying her head upon it properly. Whether this story is true or not, it captures something essential about Catherine's final days, a girl trying desperately to face her death with the dignity expected of a queen, even as everything she had ever known crumbled around her. On the morning of February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was led from the Tower of London to the scaffold on Tower Green, the same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had met her end just 6 years earlier. As she walked those final steps, did she think of her childhood in the Dowager Duchess's household, where the seeds of her destruction had been planted? Did she remember the music lessons with Manox, the stolen moments with Derham, or the intoxicating early days of her marriage to the king? Or did her mind, mercifully, focus only on the prayers that might carry her soul to whatever lay beyond? With a single stroke of the executioner's axe, Catherine Howard's brief life ended, and with it, Henry VIII's last attempt at finding happiness in marriage. The king, who had once called her his rose without a thorn, never spoke her name again. He had found his thorn, and it had been buried deep in his own heart, placed there by his own hand and the cruel machinations of Tudor politics. Catherine Howard's story serves as a haunting reminder of the price of power in Tudor England, where young women were pawns in games they could never fully understand, and where the difference between a crown and a coffin could be measured in a heartbeat. In the end, she was neither villain nor innocent victim, but something more human, a girl who made the tragic mistake of trying to find love in a world that had no room for such luxuries, especially not for queens.